So speaking of Merkator, let's get into the review of it, and I'm happy to say that I finally acquired a copy of this out-of-print game. So I apologize for those who may have heard of this game for the first time, as you listen or watch this, or if you are interested in this game and it's too expensive for you, haven't found a copy yet, I do apologize, but I was able to locate a copy pretty close to me, and as it happens to be my birthday month, I decided to take the plunge and spend some money for it. So I will say that I have tried this game prior to purchasing it on Tabletop Simulator, so if you want to try the game out, it is available there. And my plays of it have been primarily solo thus far. I haven't played the multiplayer yet, but I would say that a good 90%, 95% of the game is as it is mechanically solo as it is in the multiplayer. So I don't think it's going to be very different, but I will update you if it is. So as a quick overview in Merkator, you are merchants in Europe during the rise of Hamburg in the 30 Years' War, using order fulfillment to represent trading goods. You also travel across a map to collect goods to trade in a pick up and deliver fashion. The game ends as soon as time runs out or when the highest contract is taken, and I will explain all of this in the game highlights to come. So first of all, for game highlights, contract fulfillment. The catch in this game is that when you fulfill a contract on your board, each contract has a number assigned to it starting at 2 and going all the way up to 10, with the highest game-ending contract at 14. And when you fulfill a contract, you get a contract of the next higher number from the top of the pile that it's on. The contracts get harder to fulfill the higher the numbers are, so the game feels like it is having you progress over time through harder and harder contracts, rather than rinsing and repeating with just different similar level style contracts the whole game. And these higher contracts give you more money to be able to do things during the game, like buying buildings, etc. The second aspect of this game is quote-unquote time travel, and no, this is not like Anachrony. When you travel to a certain city, you either gain or lose time markers. So you need to save up time tokens to get to certain spaces on the board. In addition, when another player goes to a location, you can spend your own tokens to travel with that player and take goods or fulfill contracts while you're there. When you take time tokens from the supply, occasionally it'll tell everyone to lose a good from their supply based off of the overall, the major rule set, and I'll get into some variations later. But eventually the time tokens on the time tracker board, will run out, thus leading to the end of the game, or one of the ways that this game end can trigger. The third thing about this game is the multi-use goods. So each color of good comes from one major location on the central board, and the colors can represent different goods on your personal tableau, where you decide to store those cubes. Each color having 2 different icons they can represent, or 2 different versions of the same color, like the color green cubes representing both muskets and clothing, for example. The contracts you fulfill have to do with the color and the icons they represent, and so there are some decisions to be made when collecting goods and assigning them to your different silos on your board to be able to think ahead and plan which contracts you want to fulfill, etc. Fourth, the building and bonus cards. So along the way, you can use money that you have acquired from fulfilling contracts to buy bonus cards to give you extra goods when visiting certain cities. Also, you can use money to buy building cards, which have different unique requirements to be able to purchase them in addition to the cost, but they give you major points, just straight up victory points, for the endgame. Then finally, variations of play. So the solo game differs from the main game, where instead of using money to buy contracts, you use the contracts themselves, and the number that is assigned to these contracts as the currency that you use to acquire different things during the game. You can play a long game versus a short game. You can alter the different rules of the game, like how many contracts or cards you can hold in your hand, how the time tokens are used, etc. So you can tailor the experience based off of preference. Going into game comparisons, so the first game that I thought of was Splendor. Take the basic idea of contract fulfillment and think of Merkator utilizing a similar feeling to Splendor, where additional contracts fulfilled means you have better opportunities to fulfill bigger contracts later on, as you do in Splendor, where as you collect these acquired contracts that you've fulfilled with your gems, it increases your base amount of currency that you can utilize to purchase bigger contracts later on. So it happens a little differently in each game, with Merkator being a little bit more complicated with its progressing order contract scheme rather than just collecting gems and turning them into resources that you can utilize later on. But the gist, I think, is kind of the same, where you are making progress towards bigger and bigger contracts. The second game that I remember most recently having a component of traveling around a map for resources is Lacrimosa from Devere. And it closely resembles Merkator, using some sort of resource like money in Lacrimosa as well as time in Merkator to move your character across a shared board where you are traveling across a geographic area and collecting resources and bonuses along the way. And so that is kind of represented in both games. Next comparison is Race for the Galaxy. So the small tie in between Merkator and games like Race for the Galaxy, or other games that I thought of like Earth as well, is that the action taken by the current player may be followed by or utilized in conjunction with other players optionally. So, and this is a reference to the fact that as you travel to a location, you get to pay the player a time token or two, depending on the location that you're going to, in order to utilize that location for goods or fulfilling contracts. And so paying attention to where your opponents are going is helpful and crucial to being efficient with your game, and keeps you involved during other players' turns in a not as upfront and straightforward way as Race for the Galaxy does, but it does help keep that downplay feeling minimized to a degree. And then finally, Patchwork is my last comparison, which happens to be a Rosenblog game as well, but both games share an element of time as a resource. With Merkator, the time tokens dictating the end of the game and allowing you to go to certain locations as well is one way the game can end, if not by the other way, which is obtaining the last contract, which is the Piece of Westphalia, which gives you some bonus points there. So there are two different ways to end the game, but one of them does revolve around time, and Patchwork is similar, where the time track and the game end trigger of the game is variable based off of how fast you are progressing on the time track board that is shared between the two players in Patchwork, and that is based off of the tiles that you purchase and place onto your board, which each tile has an amount of spaces on the time track that you move forward with. So every game will be variable, and how many turns you play and how long the games will be based off of how fast you move through when purchasing tiles in Patchwork or utilizing those time tokens in Merkator. So there are probably some other games that do utilize time as a resource, not necessarily in a thematic sense, but in the physical resource version. I can't think of any of those right now, but Patchwork, fortunately by the same designer, kind of fits that bill. So going into the peer review, a lot of these reviews came from years before, when the game was hotter and more readily available, but I think it still stands the test of time of how people felt about the game and how it would be represented today. So some praise that the game received many years back was, and I should mention that this game was published in 2010. But anyway, many people praised this game as a departure from the usual theme and mechanisms at the time, strategically with multiple ways to win the game, either going down the order fulfillment route and collecting those contracts for money and points, versus focusing mostly on buildings and etc., or a mix of the two. A lot of people mention that this game shines at two players, where competitive decisions seem to be at their best and the turns are a little bit more snappy and there is quicker gameplay, which is very comparable to his other games that seem to be best at two, such as the base game of A Feast for Odin, and obviously his two-player only games like Fields of Arle. The play and rules are elegant in Merkator, and some people really enjoy the variations in rules, finding something that really tailors and fits their game style best with themselves as well as their regular groups. There are some concerns though, and many people disparage the look of the game. It is abstracted with the art, the very beige color of the game, the minimalistic thematic integration as well as presentation of components of the game, like just colored cubes instead of representation of what they might be, which is understandable based off of how those colored cubes are, but still it does come across as a very basic presentation for visual appearances. Some people don't like how variable the rule set is. They prefer to have one right way to play the game, and that's it. Some people find the game to be too random as well, with contracts, bonus cards, building cards, etc. coming out at different times and not having a full enough market of a display of these different contracts and cards to choose from, which can really alter your gameplay and be a little bit too tactical for some people to influence their decisions to be competitive. And this is, I think, especially true at higher player counts. And so strategically, in some, people feel that it's a repetitive game, kind of a rinse and repeat. You're just traveling and picking up and delivering, which I guess a lot of pick up and deliver games kind of represent a kind of rinse and repeat format. And it might be a little too light for what it's trying to be presented as, especially in comparison to some of Rosenberg's other heavier Euro titles. So what do I think about Merkator? This game stands out as being mechanically and thematically very different than any other of Rosenberg's games. Perhaps now, in retrospect, there are a lot more industrialized or, say, more economic games that are not agricultural or farming themed, such as Oranienburger Canal or Glass Road for that matter. And so it made me think, why didn't this very unique game did not appeal to as many people back then when it was released, and hence it not receiving the love that perhaps it could have received in the form of reprints and different versions like some of his other games have received since. Sure, the artwork and table presence are a bit dull, but as soon as I started to understand how the different mechanisms of the game play together, taking aside the presentation of the game, with the way that you upgraded contracts throughout the game and having that being progressed from easier contracts to harder contracts, or using the time tokens to accompany other players' turns, being more aware of what other people are doing on their turns, and multiple routes to getting victory points and winning the game. I thought that this was at least a very mechanically sound game and elegant game. I've had a lot of fun playing the solo game too. Once again, it doesn't venture too far off of what I believe the multiplayer experience would offer, but it does so in a different and unique way that playing the two versions of the game feel different. It felt a lot like Glass Road, making decisions that sometimes you had to take a chance with, because some things, like the order of the cards that you play out in Glass Road from your hand in the solo version, is frankly up to chance, and the same thing can happen with the orders in the solo version of Glass Road, or the contracts rather, where the time tracker of the solo version is based off of a deck of the highest numbered contracts being flipped over and made available. And so you can try to plan for a contract to be fulfilled, but you only have one turn to do so before the next card is flipped over. And so there is some chance involved and a lot of tactical reaction to what is being revealed. While trying to mitigate that as minimally as possible is the crux of the solo version of both games. And so it does depart from the more deterministic approach of the multiplayer versions of both games, as well as other Rosenberg games as well. And so there is a unique feeling to how it plays in the solo version, at least. This game ranks highly for me in general because of the mechanisms mostly, although there are other Rosenberg games that do top Merkator based off of thematic integration as well as mechanical play. I do agree that this game does feel a little abstracted, and it is relying heavily on the mechanical gameplay. But I found myself energized by the comments from those who love this game for what it mechanically is, saying how strategic and deep this game can get, especially as you play in a two-player setting. It's a quick game too, falling around the same playtime as Glass Road, if not a little bit longer, and perhaps around the same time as Newsfjord and Ediwa, which is a bonus for me because it's easier to get this out and to fully teach and play this game with friends on a weeknight with a limited game time. So in sum, I think this game has some neat mechanisms that do feel unique, not only for what I believe games were at the time, perhaps drawing and being influenced by games of the time, such as Race for the Galaxy. I believe there are some influences there from those games from 15, 20 years ago. But I do believe there are some unique features that are brought to the table that are unique to this game that aren't found in any other games that I at least have played or am aware of recently, and from 10, 15 years ago as well. And so it's a game, and this is represented by how broadly I've had to compare this game to in order to make comparisons from the different mechanisms and highlights from this game. And so in and of itself, Merkator is a very unique and very interesting addition to the Rosenblog big box line. And there are probably some games from 10-15 years ago that resemble Merkator, and I am just not aware of. But at least from my perspective, I'm happy to have this in my collection and keep it, not only because of the monetary investment that I made into it being an out-of-print game, but I think it is a game that I can pull out and teach people and still have them enjoy the experience, even though it does not have the flashy and updated and modernized art that a lot of games have, component-wise as well. The quality baseline has definitely elevated since then, but I think mechanically this game has a lot to offer that can be a real fun time for players who play it for the first time and aren't familiar with these different styles and genres of gameplay, such as pick up and deliver. And it being a pick up and deliver game that is so unique from Rosenblog's repertoire as well, it's something that I do enjoy, and I feel good about having it in my collection so I can play it solo, I can play it with other players, and have a different experience versus all of the other farming related games that I have on the shelf. And so, speaking of that, let's